Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
So we like to start by going around and saying our names. Some people did arrive while we were sitting. Take a count for who's in the room. Maybe we can just start on the first row. And also, if you're comfortable, I like to encourage people to also share their preferred personal pronoun as you feel comfortable. Feel the need. David, he, him.
Shantanu.
I'm Kay.
My name is Andre.
Lara, she, her.
Bob.
Henry.
Jason, he, him.
Jonathan.
Donald, he, him.
Brad.
Norman.
Michael.
My name is Stephen.
Tony.
My name is Ray.
Peter, he, him.
I'm Clint.
Tim, he, him.
Jeff.
I'm David.
Peter.
My name is Mark. He, him.
Jim.
Susan, she, her.
Bob.
My name is Samuel.
My name is Joe. I'm Richard. He, him.
I'm Mike. I'm Jim.
Tom.
Larry.
Welcome back. Thank you, Dr. Donald Rothberg, for joining us today. I think it's cool in particular that you're here because we have a book group that happens monthly, and we've been reading Mary Yang's Awakening together, some of us. And in fact, we're meeting next week to finish talking about it. But your work is really related, I think, in a lot of ways. So Donald is the author of a book that's on the table called The Engaged Spiritual Life, a Buddhist Approach to Transforming Ourselves and the World. And has directed a 2-year training connecting individual and social transformation. He's been a practitioner of insight meditation and has received training in Tibetan Dzogchen and Mahamudra practices, as well as the Hakomi approach, as well as trauma responsive work. And I also learned, which you could say more about, was in the pre-day event of the Gay Buddhist Fellowship was part of organizing a weekend institute out of which GBF sort of blossomed, as I understanding it. So you've had a long-standing connection to this group.
Yeah, was that, Flint, you were involved, weren't you? Was the...
No, I joined UBF about 3 or 4 weeks after it started. So,
yeah, it was 1992, I think, right?
Jesus Christ, am I that old? I don't remember the year, but that sounds about right.
We did a summer institute with Buddhist Peace Fellowship for about a week, and we worked with the principle of having large part of the summer institute be self-organizing. So we took some responsibility, like for the mornings, and the afternoons were open, and we had a process whereby people self-organized into what was compelling. And I think I was talking with David, I'm not sure if it was just gay men or gay lesbian.
No, it was always gay men.
It was gay men. So there was a group at the Summer Institute, and shortly after that, Gay Buddhist Fellowship formed.
It was Gay Buddhist Fraternity at that time.
Yeah.
We got all this collegiate.
Yeah. So I've been pleased to return in a way over the years. So haven't been here for probably at least 2 or 3 years, I think. good to be here.
Yeah, welcome everybody.
Thank you. And since I don't come that often, I thought I would talk about the most fundamental dimension of our practice. I mean, it's helpful if that comes up anyway in all talks, but I wanted to really go right into the core of the practice, which in the language of the Buddha is going to the end of dukkha. So the Buddha often said, I teach dukkha and the end of dukkha. So what does that mean? That's what I want to explore with both in understanding the teaching, understanding more clearly how this guides our practice, our daily practice, and then make some connections also with Pride Day. And I was reflecting when you were talking initially, I remember reading probably 2 or 3 weeks ago an article, it was either in the Chronicle or the New York Times, maybe some of you remember, which said that basically 75% of gay, lesbian, etc. populations are under heavy oppression in the world. Anyone remember that article? It gave a figure to it. It was like 75%, around that. Of course, there's oppression here, as you were saying, but the really thick oppression, 75%. So that's sort of a backdrop for this. So the teaching of dukkha and the end of dukkha is the central teaching, but what does it mean? And it's, I find it actually confusing. It's a confusing teaching. We may think that it's clear, but when I hear other teachers teach it or see the way it's talked about, I think it's quite confusing. What does that mean? One of the reasons it's confusing is that there are multiple meanings of dukkha. It's usually translated as suffering, right? So we talk about the end of suffering. But that can be confusing too. And so I think there are at least 4 different meanings of dukkha in the text. And one of the challenges that we have, especially if we go by the teachings of the Buddha in the Pali Canon, I think people are influenced here by multiple Buddhist traditions, but if we work with the teachings from the Pali Canon or simply talk about the early teachings, they were written down discourses. The Buddha didn't systematize everything. He didn't say, I've over 30, 40 years, I've talked about this in a lot of ways. Let's clean it up. Let's just have one, one complete record. He didn't do that. So we get a lot of different teachings, and a lot of stuff is fairly clear, but a lot of things are not systematized, and later Buddhists sometimes tried to systematize things that weren't systematized, and that didn't go so well either. So just for example, I think there are at least 4 meanings of dukkha. And listen for these different meanings in terms of understanding what the end of dukkha means. So I'm going to suggest that the first 3 of them, it's confusing to understand what the end of dukkha is, and the 4th is a clearer meaning. And that's good. I'm going to say that is really at the core of the teaching. So the first sense of dukkha is dukkha as the unpleasant, right? And this is like when the Buddha talked about dukkha, he often pointed to the challenging or painful aspects of life. He talked about birth, old age, and so forth. Different kinds of painful experiences. And this is probably the main way that dukkha is talked about. Basically unpleasant experiences. And sometimes when we hear the word suffering, we may associate, suffering may simply be a synonym of unpleasant experiences. If it's simply unpleasant experiences, then what does the end of dukkha mean? To be human is to sometimes have unpleasant experiences. So the end of dukkha can't mean the end of unpleasant experiences. Can't really mean that. A second meaning that we find often is the sense that even if we have pleasant experiences, because of impermanence, they will soon change. And they will, the pleasant will at some point become unpleasant. And that's taken to be a form of dukkha as well. It's called viparanama sukha. The first kind of dukkha, the unpleasant, is called dukkha. And then there's a third kind of dukkha, which is the fact that this is called sankhara dukkha, and this is the fact that nothing of a conditioned nature will give lasting satisfaction. And that's what that teaching is, right? That is also taken to be a kind of dukkha, the fact that if we try to take any conditioned phenomena, any state of mind, any way our life is, anything we get, anything we don't get, and that if we try to take that as being what will answer our quest for a satisfactory life, it won't do it. Right? But again, we can ask, what does the end of dukkha mean? Because that kind of experience, the fact that things in themselves won't give lasting satisfaction, that's always going to be here. So what's the end of dukkha? So I think it can be quite confusing. The fourth sense of dukkha, I think, is what we get a little bit more from the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. But even that I think is confusing. Anyone ever found the Four Noble Truths confusing? I think it can be quite confusing, especially when you translate dukkha as suffering. Because unless we have a very precise meaning for suffering, again, what does it mean to end dukkha? It doesn't mean to end unpleasant experiences, right? And so I think the core meaning, here's where we're getting there. I think the core meaning for our practice of dukkha is dukkha as reactivity. And I think we can talk about it in very, very ordinary English, very straightforwardly, in a way in which the end of dukkha makes sense. And so there's a teaching that's, I think, for me, a more succinct way of talking about the Four Noble Truths that some of you probably know, called the teaching of the two arrows, sometimes called the teaching of the two darts. And this is, for me, a beginning of an unpacking of dukkha as reactivity. It goes like this. Everyone at times has unpleasant experiences. And the Buddha was talking to a group of practitioners, and he said, everyone at times has these unpleasant, difficult experiences. How does a practitioner differ from a non-practitioner? And we should understand non-practitioner to mean people who think they're practitioners when they're not practicing. So what differentiates a practitioner from a non-practitioner in terms of how they relate to the unpleasant? No one answered him, and so he answered his own question, which was a very common pedagogical strategy that the Buddha had. And so he answered his own question. He said, someone who is a non-practitioner, when there is an unpleasant experience, and he was particularly talking about unpleasant physical experiences, although I want to generalize and talk about any kind of unpleasant experience. So we could talk about unpleasant physical experiences, which we all have from time to time, unpleasant mental emotional experiences, difficult emotions, unpleasant interactions, unpleasant experiences related to injustice or not being treated fairly. And this is all part of what all of us experience. We at times have unpleasant experiences of any of those kinds. And the Buddha said, in that, everyone is the same. A practitioner does not differ from a non-practitioner in terms of having these unpleasant experiences at times. But he said, and he called those unpleasant experiences, he said it was like being shot by an arrow. An arrow of what's unpleasant. He said, everyone at times is shot by an arrow. He talked about that as the first arrow. Everyone at times is shot by the first arrow in one or more of those ways. And he said that a non-practitioner, because of being shot by the first arrow, will tend to shoot a second arrow as if that would help. So how do we do that? We have unpleasant physical experiences. We shoot a second arrow in multiple possible ways. We may tense around the unpleasant physical experiences as if that's going to help, right? And some people with chronic pain, that tension is a large part of their lives. If there's chronic pain, some types of chronic pain, not all, but some of them people will tense. And so actually the first medical intervention using mindfulness was done by John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School for people with chronic pain. And some people said as much as 80% of the pain was the reaction to the initial unpleasant sensations, tensing around it. And they found if you could eliminate a large percentage of that 80%, still pain, but all of a sudden it's greatly reduced. And they found that they could do that with mindfulness. So we can tense at times around some forms of physical pain. And of course we can have all sorts of mental ways we shoot the second arrow as well. We can blame ourselves, we can blame others. You know, I was walking across the living room and I tripped on my partner's shoe, stubbed my toe, it hurts. I shoot the second arrow by blaming my partner. So we can have the physical experiences and shoot the second arrow. We can have emotional or mental experiences. Something difficult happens and I shoot the second arrow by blaming myself, blaming others, telling a negative story about myself, about others, about the world. Very, very common, right? Any of us do that within the last 24 hours? Do a show of hands. About half. Raise their hand. And so we can shoot the second arrow in that way. We can have difficult interpersonal experiences, and we may instantly shoot the second arrow. Someone says something nasty to me, I react right back by saying something nasty, right? That is shooting the second arrow. And we can do that. I have received injustice, and I can react by shooting the second arrow. I have received pain, I will inflict pain. Right? I can do that. And a lot of the conflicts in the world are two groups shooting second arrows at each other. That describes a lot of what's going on in the world, even if one group did it first. Or maybe has power on it, more power on its side and so forth, but there's still that shooting of the second arrow. And so in this fourth way of understanding dukkha is reactivity. And the teaching points to one form of reactivity. I like understanding dukkha as reactivity because it really, we can see something that we don't see so easily, even in the Four Noble Truths, is that there are two major forms of reactivity. One is pushing away the unpleasant in various ways, that's shooting the second arrow. The other is grabbing hold of the pleasant, which is a form of reactivity. So you remember that in the Four Noble Truths teaching, the Buddha says, first noble truth, there is dukkha. And he points particularly to the unpleasant, right? That's what the first noble truth is about. But curiously, perhaps, The second noble truth, the cause of dukkha, is grasping after the pleasant. Have you ever seen that asymmetry and been a little confused? The first noble truth is about what you do with the unpleasant. The second noble truth is about what you do with the pleasant. How are they connected, right? And the way I think he's actually pointing to the fact that there are two forms of reactivity. The pushing away the unpleasant compulsively, reactively, and the grabbing hold of the pleasant. Right? And so the teaching about reactivity helps us see that there's these two forms, and it also helps us to avoid a certain confusion that can be there when we interpret dukkha as suffering. Because unless we make a very strong, almost technical distinction between what's unpleasant or painful on the one hand and the reaction to it, and call the reaction suffering, then there's going to be confusion when you talk about ending suffering. Right? You have to be really precise. Some people are. I remember I go to teach in Kentucky every year, and one year one of my people I was working with, who's a hospice nurse, said she was working with this woman in hospice, a double amputee, who had a sign at the end of her bed, and the sign said, "Pain is a given, suffering is an option." Right? That's making a distinction between the first arrow and the second arrow, or we could say between pain and suffering. And that in that sense, suffering is a form of reactivity. It's the resistance to the present moment. Right? But we have to be really clear when we use that language. So I like reactivity, and it also, I think, makes the teachings really, really clear and simple. Right? Our aim is to be moment to moment responsive rather than reactive. It's that simple, I think, right? And we responsive is ordinary English, but it also, in a way, points to some very deep dimensions. We could say that if I'm truly responsive, I'm free. Responsiveness points to the quality of non-reactivity, pointing to a kind of freedom. We could also say it points to a kind of wisdom. If I'm really responsive, I know that being reactive isn't going to really help. I know that deeply. And I may also, responsiveness I think also carries the dimension of love. That to be truly responsive, I bring the energy of compassion and love forth. And so ordinary English, but I think this is really pointing to what is right at the center of our practice in a way which I think is very faithful to the traditional teachings. So then, how do we practice? Again, this is really pointing to ways of practicing that will be very, very familiar. So a few ways to practice. I think if the core of our practice is transforming reactivity into responsiveness, which I believe it is, how do we practice? We want to obviously be on the lookout for moments of reactivity. And if we notice it, if the reactivity is workable or manageable, then there are ways we can practice. And I'll talk about those ways in a moment. But it's very important to know if the reactivity is in the workable range, because sometimes it's not. We have a history of trauma, or in certain moments we're just overwhelmed. And at those moments, what we need to do with reactivity is to find ways to come back to balance. So that's a really crucial pointer. We can't just be mindful of reactivity if it's too much. So we always want to ascertain what's the level of reactivity. Is it workable? If it's not, do things which bring one back. It could be all sorts of things, something physical, take a walk, talk to a friend, do trauma practices, all sorts of things that one can do to come back to balance. Do metta practice, metta, loving kindness practice. One of the stories around loving kindness is it was an antidote to fear. loving kindness can be great for coming back to balance. I could tell some stories about that. The one, I'll tell a little one. The main one comes to mind is when I was at a retreat center called Taramandala, and I took a camping place which was kind of remote. It was away from the nearest persons were like a quarter mile away, and they told me that a bear had been there last week. But they told me they caught the bear and taken it a little bit away. And so I said, okay, looks like a great place. And then, at night, 9:30, it didn't look that good. And I started feeling fear. And, in that moment, probably most of us have had the experience of like camping where every little twig there's a sound related to a twig means the bear is coming, right? And so it took a little while, but at a certain point I said, time for loving kindness practice. Because loving kindness can be an antidote when we're kind of out of whack. And so I eventually practiced it for 3 hours because it was heavy overwhelm, right? And it worked, and I was able to stay in that place. I was doing loving kindness mostly for me and others, but partly for the bear. Anyway, and so that's the first guidance for practice, is to ascertain the level of activation, reactivity, and so forth. And okay, if the activation, the reactivity is workable, then a lot of things which are really familiar, I think, to most of us, well, I'll just name them. We want to look at the forms of reactivity. And one particular teaching, that is the teaching of dependent origination, is really, really helpful for working with reactivity. Some of you remember, this is the core of the Buddhist teaching. It's another way you can see that he's really getting at reactivity. Some of you remember this, the dependent origination teaching is complicated, and it's more or less identifying what comes before experience that leads to a continuation of dukkha, and that is particularly focusing on ignorance. But the place I want to focus is what happens in experience, and then if we just follow our conditioned ignorance, we keep going in loops. So the Buddha, like contemporary neuroscience, emphasizes the loopy nature of our minds. Okay? And so the Buddha said there are 4 steps that really point out what happens, I would say, with reactivity. The first is there's contact with some experience of the senses, meaning the senses as we think of them, the 5 senses and also the mind. Some experience, something happens, we have some encounter with someone. Based on that contact, there is some kind of feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. When we're not mindful of the pleasant, we will tend to want it and then grasp it. Those are the 3rd and 4th steps. Wanting and grasping. When we're not mindful of the unpleasant, we will tend to not want it and push it away. And that cycle just keeps on happening. So meditation can help us to study that kind of pattern really closely. And so in this context, studying when we have an unpleasant or pleasant experience is crucial. So next time you have an unpleasant experience and it's workable, see what it's like, stay with it. Next time you have a pleasant experience, do the same. I did this once with a group where I said, there's no problem being with pleasant experiences, it's what you do with it, that's the problem. And I said, we could stay here eating chocolate the whole of our session next time, and that wouldn't be an issue. And they said, let's try it. and so we stay just being with the pleasant and watch what goes on in the mind. Is there a tendency to want and grasp? Same thing with the unpleasant. You can really look out for any unpleasant experience. Sometimes the unpleasant just goes immediately to the reaction, right? You think of someone says something I don't like. I just immediately react. There's actually an unpleasant experience there, but it just goes too quickly. So sometimes we can actually have the reactive experience occur, know that it's unpleasant, or know that we reacted, and then say, what's the unpleasant experience right now? oh, I didn't really like what that person said. That doesn't feel good. But sometimes actually reverse, go from the reactivity and say what's unpleasant. Because the teaching is that if you can be with the pleasant or the unpleasant with awareness, you can watch the tendencies to reactivity and not be reactive. That's with certain, that's where you can actually do, explore it in meditation. But that can give a template for what we do in the flow of experience. Of course, where it's harder. We're having a discussion, someone said something we don't like or said something judgmental towards me. It's hard not to be immediately reactive. We can be reactive and not say something. What I'm going to point to is each of us needs to be an expert on our 5 main forms of reactivity. This is probably not in the promotional literature for the Gay Buddhist Fellowship. Come to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship, study your 5 main forms of reactivity, become really knowledgeable about it. But isn't that a big part of the practice? It's not the only part. We want to develop beautiful states as well. But a big part of the practice is studying basically where we lose it. Again, it's not in the promotional material for Spirit Rock. We talked about mindfulness, loving kindness, compassion, wisdom. Don't say, come study all the places that you really lose it, are reactive, explore your neuroses. That's what I'm giving a pep talk for that. And pointing to the way that it's really crucial. And so we want to study the different ways that we're reactive. Study the ways we grasp. What are the ways I grasp? What are the main areas where there's grasping? Maybe it's food or sex or self-image, or we need to study all these. This is what the Buddha is pointing to in talking about understanding dukkha, and moving towards the end of dukkha means working through our reactivity. And again, in our practice we've experienced a lot of ways. A lot of us are probably non-reactive now compared to some area of our life where we're reactive 3 years ago, or 5, or 10, or 20 years ago, right? How many can relate to that? Non-reactivity is a fruit of the practice, right? So we need to study the ways that we grasp and study the ways we push away. Again, it can be all sorts of ways. For both of them, we can. I once offered a class called Greed Management, which is studying the way we grasp through greed. This is a while ago, but I had extremely low enrollment in the class. In fact, we had 2 teachers and 5 students.
Wow.
But the 5 of them were really into it, and the teachers were too. We were really into it, and I don't even think we charged money. We were just really into it as teachers. I don't even know if there was Donna. So anyway. But we loved it, and we studied. It was really illuminating just to study the dynamics of greed, which we found really interesting. That when we looked at greed, there was often a sense of compulsivity, it's kind of obvious. Also a sense of no concern for consequences. Other people's needs don't matter. And often there was a sense of entitlement or privilege. It's interesting. It's interesting to study it closely. We had our final exam for the class. We did silent walking meditation for 30 minutes in a newly opened Bed Bath & Beyond. So study greed, study the forms of pushing away, reactivity of that kind. Study your anger, study your judgmental mind. Look at it. It's not easy, right? Sometimes we need that group on greed. I've taught a lot, as some of you know, and I'm working on a book on transforming the judgmental mind. I've been teaching groups and day-longs for 17 years. Based on the fact that I've totally worked through my own judgmental mind. That was a joke. So we want to, so we want to study our own reactivity. Another side is that some of the time that we're studying that a lot, it's really crucial to bring in compassion practice and the loving kindness and hold it with some care, because looking at our reactivity, it's not altogether pretty. Right? If we do it a lot, we want to balance it by bringing out our own sense of our own beauty and positive qualities. So just when we're looking a lot at reactivity, really important to look, to develop a lot in the beautiful qualities. Do practices which gladden the mind, bring about compassion, and so forth. Let's see if I have anything else to say here. Of course, there is a lot more I could say in terms of how to. I'm mostly focusing on the meditation practice. Another area that I enjoy teaching on is speech practice, and there's an enormous amount that we could explore about how to develop non-reactivity in the context of speech. It's huge. I'm not going to go so much there because that would be like a series of talks or a retreat or something like that. But just to name that as a big area, how do we work with skillful speech when we're reactive or we're in a situation or we're going to a situation where other people are reactive, where we know that we might become reactive. And so I wanted to end by just pointing a little bit to the relevance of these teachings to Pride Day and to generally working for more justice in the world. And some of you, when I talked about the teaching of the 2 arrows and the idea of not shooting the second arrow, may have heard an echo of the teachings of Gandhi and King on nonviolence. Because I think that the core of the teaching of the Buddha about dukkha and the end of dukkha is pretty close to what we find with teachings of nonviolence, Gandhi and King. They basically say, we have received pain and oppression. We will not pass on the pain and oppression to others. That we will meet a moment of injustice with wisdom and love. Tall order, right? It's a very tall order, but that's the teaching that they have, that they really give, that we will not simply react to our own pain and the injustice, but that we will try to respond in a way which is on a different level. Again, very challenging, but very, very clearly the teaching. Right? Very, very clearly the teaching. And for me, it points to the way that we can have reactivity even though we have reactivity about injustice. We can have reactivity about things that are wrong. We can have reactivity about things that are unjust. And I think this is why simply having right on our side, so to speak, is not the end of the story. And I think it points to what Gandhi and King, Dorothy Day, and others who have a kind of a spiritually grounded activism are pointing to. The fact that there's both inner work and outer work to be done. Part of the inner work is working through the reactivity. And you can see this if you read the work of Gandhi, King, Dorothy Day, and others. They took this as something really crucial. And again, I've done a lot of teaching with activists, and this is it's a big issue, right? In fact, I remember one workshop I did. There was a conference a while ago on spiritual activism in Berkeley. I did a workshop there, and I asked them, what is your major challenge with your work? And they said, the fact that our fellow activists dump on each other all the time. Right? That they're reacting with each other. It's almost like the frustration or whatever builds up. It's hard to know how to work with that. And so maybe I'll just close with that and saying that is really that the application of the teachings of non-reactivity, of dukkha and the end of the dukkha, are also very appropriate for those engaged in social justice. And again, it's at the heart of, I think, what for me are the most inspiring teachings and practitioners in this area. Gandhi King, plenty of others. So let me end with just a few quotes, okay? First is from the Buddha. Hatred never ends through hatred. By non-hatred and love alone does it end. This is an ancient truth. It's from the Dhammapada. Hatred never ends through hatred. And this is from Dr. King. The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposites into friends. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of human beings. And then the last one is from Larry Yang. This was from his reflections on when he was a Grand Marshal in the parade 3 years ago. And he said this: as we transform our own experience and relationship to our realities, we cannot help but affect those around us. We cannot help but affect those around us and read in circles into a larger culture. These moments of freedom and transformation begin to change and elevate the consciousness and awareness of the world. So our own practice necessarily affects the world. Our own non-reactivity deepens non-reactivity in the world. So, thank you. We have some time. I always like to have time for interchange. It's actually, I like it much better than giving talks.
In the Zen Center on Page Street, they had talks of various enlightened beings. I don't know their names, but some of them are very serene, but there are some that are very fierce,
Yeah.
and scary looking too. And I wonder if there's a role for fierceness that's not reactive.
Yeah.
It says if you see a great injustice being done by a person with great power, where passivity is not the answer, but you have to respond, and they don't listen to a response unless it's a fierce response.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for help bringing out that point, because when I had my notes, but I didn't look at my notes. I had that this responsiveness is about action. It's not about passivity, right? All of non-reactivity can sound a little passive. Responsiveness doesn't, right? That's very clear. So this isn't about passivity. Yeah, and definitely a place for non-reactive fierceness. Not an easy practice, right? But definitely a place for it, and it is pointed to in a lot of the different traditions and teachings, right? How does one manifest that kind of strength, fierceness? You read the suttas, the Buddha seems to be pretty fierce sometimes. He's definitely not a nice guy. He's definitely confrontative, talks very directly at times, and so forth. So I would say, it's a challenging practice, but to know how to be very direct. And so it really points to the integration of the inner work with the action, because that fierceness won't tend towards non-reactivity unless there's been a lot of inner work. Right? So it really is crucial. And there's specific teachings in Mahayana tradition on some of this, on how to develop, and ways to have that fierceness develop. Thank you. Thanks for bringing it out. Jim?
Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful talk. And it clarified. When I have a hangnail, I can't play the piano. But that clearly is not what Buddhism is about. So, thank you. You said something about, and I wanted to go back and say, repeat that please. It was about the loop of being mindful of how the unpleasant becomes, how the pleasant becomes unpleasant. And
This is the teaching of dependent origination, which I understand is circular, and like it is looping. Basically, on the basis of ignorance and bad habits, we will basically be reactive. And that basically, every moment we're reactive, we keep the habit energy going. That's the essence of a looping quality. And so what we want to do is interrupt the looping, right? And that's what mindfulness can do that. And sometimes when you notice tendencies to reactivity, simply saying, I will not be reactive, goes a long way, right? You know, if you can catch the tendency to reactivity, then we might say, maybe I won't say that now. And that's huge, right? Does that check it out, Jim?
Well, there's also going to the pleasant as a form of reactivity.
Yeah, the same thing. As we have the unpleasant occur, we're not mindful, we push away. The pleasant occurs, we are not mindful, we tend to grasp. It basically just keeps the same habit energy going, that when I have something like this happening that's pleasant, I will grab. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, Lauren.
I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've forgotten the language you used, so
Yeah.
forgive me for not being able to reference that specifically. But I was interested in hearing perhaps you parse out a little bit the distinction or the experience of reactivity that's manageable and reactivity that's not. Because
Yeah.
I certainly can relate, like I can very easily think of instances where I can see it coming and I can catch myself.
Yeah.
And then there are places where, you know, in the common parlance of today, you know, I am triggered and it's like my lizard brain and I cannot, like it's over, I'm enraged or whatever before I even know what's happened.
Yeah.
And also if there is a long trajectory path that you see between the manageable and the unmanageable, in other words, you know, over a period of decades.
Yeah, no, it's an important question. Everyone hear that okay? It's a really important area to ask, like ask it when we're in a moment of relative calm or peace. Mm-hmm. Are there ways that I lose it or go into my reptilian brain, mm-hmm. however you phrase it? Mm-hmm. What are the ways I do that? That could be a helpful initial reflection. Mm-hmm. And then when I do that, can I try to be mindful? Because it usually is possible if we have that reflection ahead of time to have a little bit of mindfulness that I'm in my reptilian brain. Mm-hmm. Now, it's usually not 100%. Mm-hmm. It could be 95%. But we usually can have a little bit of mindfulness that it's happening like that. And if we can have that, then we can invoke certain strategies that help us to come back to balance, reduce the activation. Could be different things, or it might just be I'm just caught up with reactivity. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to just get out of here, or can use a very important meditative tool that I didn't mention in my talk, which is taking bathroom breaks when you're in an interpersonal situation. This was not talked about extensively by the Buddha. Basically it means when you're really, really reactive, get the hell out of there. Right? Get out of the situation. Try to do something which lets you come back to balance. And so for some of us, it's we can get out of the situation. There are 50 different ways to come back to balance, and we need to know what works for ourselves. And if there is actual trauma, it can be helpful to get guidance by someone who's skilled in trauma. And there are exercises that one can do. The main teacher I had in studying trauma, he gave a kind of a diagram which said it's really important to know the level of activation. He said there's a level of activation, there's a threshold. When you go beyond that level of activation, you're basically caught in that reptilian brain, right? And so you need to be mindful when you're getting close to it. Now, down below that threshold, we are not totally caught in that. That threshold is when we're basically out of it. So we need to be mindful and be aware of the levels of activation here and know what to do basically to deactivate at that point. Now, again, there are distinct practices. If we had another half hour, I could share a few of those. But that's, and then the last part of what you asked was, is it possible that the places where I'm reactive today, in 3 years or 1 month, I might be non-reactive? Definitely, and I think everyone here experiences that, even the really intense ones, where we're caught by the reptilian brain. One of the insights from neurosciences is neuroplasticity, right? Mm-hmm. So that even though we have these very intense imprints, we can shift. So it's very hopeful in that way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we have 3 more. Are we okay with time to take those?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know how you relate to the closing time. Okay, please.
Yeah. This doesn't affect me so much today, but in my past, for sure, I would say that a lot of my suffering came from my desire to be in a relationship.
Yeah.
I craved it, I longed for it. It was very deep. And I'm trying to sort of understand this reactivity.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand how to sort of combine, or how to sort of fold that sort of suffering, that kind of longing in with this discussion of reactivity.
No, thank you. I'm appreciating the way that certain things I didn't mention that are important to me are coming out in the discussion, because, again, this isn't about passivity, that we can, the fact that what's the difference between wanting in a healthy or skillful way and grasping, right? So we want to, and the fact that there's some grasping does that mean I should just drop it? So I don't think so, right? It's more that in the long run, the grasping will have its consequences. But for something like, I think, like a relationship or justice, of course we're going to grasp after it at times. So it's more like a practice. Can I sort of continue to purify my motivation and know that the reactivity will have its consequences, but the fact that there's reactivity is just going to come with the territory. And it doesn't mean that there's some inherent problem. Because we want some things very, very deeply. Right? And so there can be grasping. In the long run, we want to we want to see that what we want is skillful, right? And it's complicated. In Buddhism, I think there's also confusion about this in Buddhist practice, because sometimes we take the word desire and it's negative, but there are actually plenty of words in the tradition for skillful desire, aspiration. In other traditions, I think of the place in many Western mystical traditions for longing. If you think of Rumi or the Song of Solomon or something like that, there's longing can be something very deep and beautiful. So, but how do we keep on purifying it? Would be kind of a quick way of answering that. Does that get at it some?
Kind of, sort of.
Kind of.
Okay. Yeah. I don't want to take any more time.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Please.
I appreciate what you're saying about kind of various kinds of suffering. But it seems to me that there's also part of dukkha that is anticipation, where you're not so much reacting to being shot by the arrow as you're waiting for the arrow to be shot. There's a fear or an anticipation of something bad happening. And sometimes it's not so apparent that you're going to be shot by an arrow. Sometimes it's much more hidden. But you still have that, that fear, perhaps, of the undesirable. And it's sometimes very difficult to react to that.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm appreciative of how these different subtleties are coming out. So my mind goes to two places based on what you said. One of them is that a lot of our reactivity is quite subtle, right? A lot of the ways that we react, we grasp, we push away, could be seen to be almost unconscious. Right? A lot of our habits and patterns are not very conscious. And so we can have forms of reactivity, and it's probably most evident, or what comes to mind is some of the work on implicit bias, probably a lot of you know, which is largely unconscious. And it's formed through social conditioning, like bias in relation to race or gender, sexual orientation. People have these almost reactive views, but they're not even aware of them. And they even can go against what they think they believe. So it's subtle. There's a lot of unconscious material here for reactivity. So that's one place that I go. The other is when we look to reactivity as it manifests in fear. It's interesting because, again, fear is always in relationship to the future. And so I may, in my fear, might involve a kind of subtle grasping of a particular storyline. This is the way it's going to be. I'm not saying all fear is that nature, but some fear is going to be grasping after the way I think things will be. And they may well be that way, right? But I could be grasping, that what I found in looking at my own experience is that when the fear is quite intense, there's a grasping after a storyline, a particular story that I sort of get caught in. But are all forms of fear reactivity? Maybe that's partly like, or is there something else there that's not really reactive? I think also what your question is bringing out is that I'm using the word reactivity as an English word to get at this phenomenon. And yet there are connotations of that word, which sort of, like, I think as you were suggesting in your question, sort of, in a way, privilege present moment reaction to something, right? But there also can be forms, I think, of what we can call reactivity in a more subtle way that have a little bit different shape, and that maybe could be there with fear in relationship to I'm kind of holding myself in anticipation of some future experience. I think it's in the family of dukkha and reactivity, but I think you're right. It looks a little different. I think that's what I was hearing. Did I get at it some?
I think that's basically kind of what I was trying to say, is that there's a level that reaction seems to be very much in the present, and where reactivity seems to be very much a process we take in the present.
But fear is always in the present. Fear is always in the present moment, even though it's relating to the future. So. But I think you're bringing out a lot of subtleties here. Thank you. Should we add one more, and then should we?
One question. So assuming we explore this reactivity in the very practical ways in which you explained to us, and I'm asking this question because you're so good at explaining things practically. What is say we've achieved the perfect state with that, is that to you an enlightened place, or what is the next evolution of the self beyond just that?
I'm using the word reactivity and pointing to non-reactivity. So we'd be talking about working through reactivity on more gross levels, but also more subtle levels. So I am interpreting total non-reactivity as being a Buddha.
Got it.
But I think what some of the questions bring out are the fact that there's reactivity that is more obvious, more gross, and there's also reactivity that is more subtle, more unconscious, doesn't look like, as in your question, doesn't look like reactivity altogether. But I think I am using that term as a way of giving the best, what I take to be the clearest single word to unpack what total freedom's about and enlightenment. Yeah. And so again, the other side of that is that again, non-reactivity. I brought this out a little bit. Full non-reactivity also means that other energies of our being, like wisdom, love, interconnection, all these things come forward. So when we use the word reactivity, we're emphasizing, as it were, the problem. But also, what comes forth are all the beautiful qualities, the positive qualities. And again, I haven't stressed so much how those are a part of transforming reactivity. I've mentioned a few times, with metta, loving-kindness, compassion. But I think in order really to work through reactivity, we have to have these beautiful states. So as that is occurring, the mindfulness, the wisdom, the compassion, the love get bigger. And eventually, when we have non-reactivity, that means we have fullness of love, wisdom, compassion, skillful action. So that's pretty good Buddha quality. Thanks. But I could stay for the next hour or two.
Thank you very much. That was a great closing to, I think, the end of suffering.
Yeah, the end of dukkha. Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here. Are there any announcements that people have? Uneventful.
Well, I'm the host.
Oh, I have one announcement.
Okay, please.
Okay. Next Sunday, the book group it's the first Sunday of the month. Right now we're reading Larry Yang's book, Awakening Together. So if you want to join, you could read it in a week. Those of you who haven't been, join us. But we do, every month we pick a book and we meet the first Monday of the month. So if you're interested in learning more about it, you can talk to me. If you're not on there's an email list with the Yahoo group. It usually goes out on that as well once we pick a new book. So, but the premise of the book group also is using readings to explore racism, white privilege, oppression, and intersecting that with our practices. So we tend to pick books that are related to either different voices, people of color, or books, specifically the readings lately have really intersected between Buddhism and community or working against these particular forces. Yeah. Richard.
So I'm your host today. There are some cookies and strawberries to enjoy. Hot water for tea. When you're done, just stick your cup in the dishwasher. There's sign-up sheets on the credenza here if you want to get our newsletter. I'm going to be coming out with the Donna Bowl. The suggested donation is $10, and you'll be hearing more about this, but the GDEB is actually running a shortfall in our finances. And besides giving Donna, we have an accounted community thrift. So if there's anything you no longer are in love with and you want to get rid of, it's a great way to support the Sangha. And if you happen to have a friend who's moving or someone died, just keep it in mind after you offer condolences, say, what about the flag? And please stay and enjoy the fellowship of the Sangha. And some people may be going out to lunch today. I'm not sure what's going on with the gay pride, so that's a possibility.
What's going on with gay pride? All right, so we'll stand in a circle and do the dedication of merit. Yeah.
Sorry.
So feeling your hearts, feeling our hearts, feel our heart. The wish for one's own well-being and that of others. Knowing that we practice for ourselves, but we also practice for others. And that our horizon of practice is to be there and practice for all beings without exception, which includes us. So may the benefits of our mourning be there for all beings, which includes us. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.